All right. Well, thank you for the invitation. So yeah, I'm Dr. Katie Van Valen. I'm one of the beef extension specialists at the University of Kentucky. And so while you might think I had a short commute here today, I actually work way out there in the tail end of Kentucky. There's a little orange star there in the little community of Princeton. I work at one of our research and education centers out there in Western Kentucky. The university has 2 cow herds. I oversee the one there in Western Kentucky, which is actually a Brangus-based cow herd, whereas our cows here in Central Kentucky are more of an Angus and Simmental-based herd. The university also has some cattle way down there in southeastern Kentucky. They've been doing some work looking at small-scale cattle production because most of the cattle that are in that part of the state are much smaller herds. And then up there in northern Kentucky, we've got the Green Star there. That farm is actually owned by the University of Kentucky, but all of the cattle there and the day-to-day management of that facility is actually done by the Kentucky Beef Network, which is a arm of our Kentucky Cattlemen's Association. So they actually run a really neat demonstration farm to show producers best management practices. They host folks from all over the world there and do a great job. So the university system's kind of throughout the state. That nice blue circle there is really where the heart of our cattle are in the state. We are the largest calf state east of the Mississippi River. We're top 10 in the nation, and we're pretty proud of that. And most of those cows are right there in that blue circle. We've got some challenges and opportunities when it comes to producing cattle here in Kentucky. We're right, that bottom graph there of the United States is, of course, the fescue belt. We've talked quite a bit about fescue. It's hard to come to Kentucky and not talk about fescue. So Kentucky 31 was found here in Menifee County, Kentucky, developed with folks from the university. So I always say we maybe created the problem and hopefully we'll help solve it too. So we do a lot of research focused around fescue toxicosis management. Depending on what map of the corn belt you look at, you'll notice out there in my way in Western Kentucky, we're just on the eastern edge of that corn belt. We do a lot of row crop production in Western Kentucky, a lot more than you'll see here in Central Kentucky. And so we don't have as many cows out there. We background a lot of calves out there because we've got that grain base to do it. So I just want to share a little bit about what we do here in Kentucky and kind of my background coming in. So when I think about any animal that I'm thinking about the nutrition and nutritional management of, whether it's a developing heifer, a mature cow, a feedlot steer, doesn't matter. Each of those animals has a job description. She has a job to do. And if we think about that replacement heifer as she goes through life and hopefully becomes a good cow for our cattlemen, then her job description is going to change. But when she's a heifer, some of the main things that she's going to have to do, she's got to grow. She doesn't have to grow a lot, real fast, about 1.5 pounds a day. That's pretty doable, but she's got to do it. She needs to stay healthy because, of course, if she's not healthy, she's probably not going to grow. Ultimately, she needs to get bred. She needs to give birth to that first calf, hopefully unassisted. Then we're going to think about her having to raise that calf, continue to grow, breed back, and wean that first calf, and then join the cow herd, right? So she has a lot that she's got to do, and if we mess up her management along the way, we can really start to impact her for the rest of her life. So I'm a nutritionist. I think a lot about nutrient requirements of cattle throughout the year, throughout their stages of production and growth, and so I like this graph a lot. We've got replacement heifer nutrient requirements in cows, and so one of my biggest things that I tell producers when we're working with these heifers is, remember, they've got to do everything that cow is expected to do, but also grow. She's got that growth requirement. And then once she has that first calf, she's tacking on that big lactation requirement when it comes to energy and protein. And so these heifers, one of the most important things that we can remember is that heifer is not a cow. So one of my, and this is Dr. Van Valen's personal thoughts on this a little bit, but that heifer's not a cow. We shouldn't treat her like one. And so when we start thinking about how we manage these heifers, they may need a little extra attention. I put it out there that if we start selecting for heifers that don't need any kind of supplementation whatsoever, because we're going to make her rough it through to make a good cow, then I'm going to argue that we probably have some cows that have a little bit too much for the environment that they're in. So these replacement heifers, they've got higher energy requirements. They've got higher protein requirements. In fact, they're really a lot more like a lactating cow. And so if we think about lactating cows having their peak requirement, those heifers are right there along with them. And so if you start to kind of think about managing them a bit like a lactating cow, that's kind of where they're at in terms of their nutrient requirements. So our goal for these heifers is reproduction, right? That's why we have heifers. That's why we have cows. They get bred. They have a calf. We sell that calf, so on and so forth. Reproduction is the most important thing when we think about the cow herd. But if you go and ask the cow, it's way down there on the priority list, okay? She's got to take care of herself first. She's got to make those maintenance requirements, right? That's the amount of nutrients she's got to get in her to just breathe and move around. Then she's going to give maintenance to growth, right? That's where it's important to think about those heifers, right? They're going to grow before they ever get bred. So that's the priority. Lactation comes into play, and then reproduction. So reproduction's way down on the list of their priorities when they think about nutrients. So if you want to think about that, putting an arrow going the opposite direction, that's what we're giving up first when we get these cattle into situations where maybe they're not getting quite enough nutrients to them. So when I think about developing a feed program for heifers, I try to simplify things. I try not to make it too complicated, but understanding what her nutrient requirements are, right? How old is she? What's her current weight? What's she gonna get to, right? Because we talked about that 1,000-pound cow versus that 14 versus maybe that 1,600-pound cow that some of us may have in our pastures. Where she starts at is going to be different, and where she needs to end up is going to be different. So what does that target average daily gain need to look like? Again, stage of production. Remembering that those nutrient requirements are never the same. They're constantly changing. Other things that we need to think about is forage first, right? In most situations, forages are the base of what we feed these cattle, and I would argue it's the most economical way to produce these cattle. So what is our forage base? Depending on the time of year, your location, all of those things, whether or not you're going to be developing these heifers in a grazing system or maybe on a stored forage system, those things are going to look different, but we need to think about what we have available to these cattle. And remember, if we start to think about that heifer as a lactating cow, she needs to make sure that we're getting on some good, our better pastures, our better forages to meet more of those requirements with less supplement. Now, I'm a nutritionist. I love to formulate supplements, right? But I also manage cattle. I don't like to feed them if I don't have to. And so I always, say that supplementation is not necessarily a bad thing. Remember, that heifer is not the cow. She may need a little supplementation to get by. And I think that's one of the best things that we can recognize about our heifer development programs is supplementing when we need to. And picking an economical supplement, right? Not always doing the same thing because that's what we've always fed or that's what's always available. I run into that in extension a lot. Well, I've always just fed this, so that's what I'm going to feed. Feed prices change. All of those things start to really change, and we can really affect our bottom line with what we select that supplement to look like. So one of the things that we need to think about too with heifers, right? They need to grow. We've talked about that. But I mentioned they only need to grow about 1.5 pounds a day. That's really not that hard to do. That's not asking a lot. Genetics that we've put into in the cattle industry today, if we look at these heifers' contemporaries that go out west, they're gaining 4+ pounds a day in the feedlot when we put the energy to them. We've got some efficient cattle in the industry, so 1.5 pounds a day is really not asking too much. But we can get these heifers too fat. And when we get heifers that get too much condition on them too quickly early in life, We really run into issues with fat deposition in udders and have udder quality issues that leads to lifetime impacts on those cattle. And I think that's one of the most important things that we have to recognize is this idea that what we do early in life can have lifetime implications for developing cattle. Other things that we see is high rates of gain early in life. We can get to decrease lifetime productivity in the herd. Those cattle are not staying in the herd, and I think sometimes what happens is we've developed them in a kind of high input fashion. They become a mature cow, and then we say, okay, you're on your own, and they kind of fall apart. We'll talk about that a little bit more on the bull side too. So, when we think about this program, it needs to be low and slow rather than high and fast. And I like the idea of developing heifers kind of in a steady state, versus letting them get by and then realizing, oh crap, breeding season's coming up and they're not where they need to be. We're going to be better off if we kind of get them there steadily. So this is some data that a colleague of mine, and I realize my credit didn't get put on there, but my colleague at the Research Center in Princeton, Dr. Chris Choich, is a forage specialist, and he helps with our Eastern Kentucky hay contest. So these are hay test results from about 233 samples from last year collected here in Kentucky. And so what we're looking at here is protein content of stored forages. And so if we think about the cow's nutrient requirements for protein, a dry cow is about 7%. A late gestating cow is about 9%. That lactating cow is about 11%. So again, think about that developing heifer. She's somewhere north of 11, typically on her protein requirement. So if we're looking at stored forages, what we are going to be able to provide, 98% of these samples met the requirements for a mid-gestation cow. 90% met that late gestation cow, and still over 50% of them met that lactating cow's protein requirement. So my point in saying this is that in these forage-based systems, especially if we're in a conserved forage system, protein is usually not the problem. That's usually not the lacking nutrient. When we look at energy, though, we start to look at some very different numbers. So 50% TDN would be requirements for mid-gestation, 55 late gestation, 60 would be lactation, and 65% is what we're looking at in some of these developing animals. So looking at those same samples, you can see that only 10% of them now meet the energy requirement of a lactating cow. None of them met the energy requirements for more of a growing type animal at about, I think I calculated that one out at about 2 pounds per day, but 1.5 pounds per day wouldn't have made a difference. And so when we start thinking about supplementation, energy is usually what is lacking. It's the most limiting nutrient, and if you've been to cattlemen's meetings, you've probably had a nutritionist tell you that, but I think this shows it pretty nicely. So I will just one note on these samples. This was all grass hay, no legumes or anything like that. So I tried to pull out anything that would be kind of unreflective of what our typical cattleman may have. So when we think about that supplementation, that economical supplementation, feed what we need when we need it, right? Do we need energy? Do we need protein? Do we need both? And those are the types of things that I think about as a nutritionist when I'm formulating rations for people. And those are things that hopefully, if you're working with a nutritionist, they're going to be thinking about it too. But when we run into situations where we just go out and feed what we've got, we can run into issues. Another thing that I don't think we give enough credit for, in this part of the state, we have an abundance of co-products. You all have partaken in one of our signature industries in the state, the bourbon industry, right? The bourbon industry gives us a lot of co-products in the cattle world. A lot of distillers' grains come from the bourbon industry. We also, in this part of the world, feed a lot of corn gluten feed. And for example, those are two that have a little bit of difference in protein content and a little bit of difference in price. And I know from working in this state, depending on where that phone call comes from, sometimes gluten's the better deal, and sometimes distillers is the better deal. Now, Distillers is almost always the highest on a cost per ton basis. But when we get down to really what that cost per pound of protein or that cost per pound of unit of energy is in those feeds, distillers is oftentimes the most economical feed choice that's out there. So again, if you're working with a nutritionist, they're doing all that thinking hopefully for you. But these are things that we do need to think about when we think about developing these supplements. I always, caution that we can overfeed some of these different supplement-based diets, whether that's starch or even high-fat diets. When forage is our base, we can really get into trouble with supplementation when we feed too much starch or we feed too much fat. If you think about how cattle are able to use grass to meet those nutrient requirements, it's all about the rumen microbes, right? Those microbes are getting in there, digesting that cellulose in that grass that you and I can't do anything with, and they're getting energy out of that. When we put a little too much starch or a little too much fat in the diet, those bugs that do all the work on the cellulose, they're not happy, and they don't do their job as well, and we can run into issues with fiber digestion. And ultimately, we're giving up efficiency and really starting to work against ourselves. And oh, by the way, now we've put money into providing supplemental feed, but we're getting even less out of the forages that we've got in front of them. So I think, there's a lot of high-fat tubs and things like that. If we're watching intake on those things, we'll probably be okay, but we can run into issues if we get feeding a little too much starch, a little too much of fat when it comes to fiber digestion. So when we think about heifer development, we get one chance to get it right. That cow's only a heifer once, whether she stays in our cow herd for another 10, 11 years, or she fails to get bred and she goes straight to the sale barn, right? She gets one chance to get it right. And so we've got to make sure that we're doing everything we can from a management standpoint to not get in her way and screw that up. So when we think about cow-calf profitability, we think about what our calf price is minus the annual cow carrying costs, right? And if for seed stock producers, you can plug that in with whatever the cost is to produce that animal, less the cost that you sell them for, that's ultimately profitability. But on the female side especially, we need to remember that she's in that herd for a number of years. Again, if we do everything right. So we need to spread that out a little bit over her lifetime. And so if you look at really looking at cow-calf profitability, we've got our calf price minus our annual cow carrying cost, times the number of years she's in the herd, less our development costs, and that should not be a multiplier, that should be a plus our salvage value. That equals our profit. So salvage value, of course, being if we're able to, at the end of her productive lifetime, get her to a sale barn or something like that versus having her die out on the pasture. That development cost then directly impacts the lifetime profitability of that animal. And so if we adjust that development cost up or down, depending on how efficiently we're able to do that, then we're ultimately impacting how long it takes her to stay in the herd to become profitable. And so it can easily be 3 to 5 years, easily. I think we've got some situations, and maybe some high input type development systems where we can see that number come up quite a bit. If she ever misses a calf, that number will increase substantially. And so we really need to understand that whatever it costs us to develop that heifer, especially if we're retaining heifers for our own herd, that we need to make sure that we're doing it in a manner that she's able to pay for herself across that lifetime. So heifer development's that critical period, right? We don't get it back. We get one chance. If we do it right, she's going to get bred. If we do it right and we select those right heifers to stay back in our herd, hopefully we're getting those older heifers that get bred earlier in that first breeding season. They're more likely to breed back more quickly, wean a heavier first calf, have an older and heavier second calf, and so on and so forth. So by getting that development right early on, we really set that animal up on a trajectory to be more profitable through her lifetime. And we can't, I think a lot of times it's easy to forget that, how that first cycle, that first season leads into the next and into the next, and now it's her whole lifetime. And so if we get them started right and we get them started early in a tight breeding season, we can really start to impact their lifetime productivity. They're not cows. We shouldn't manage them like one, right? Heifers should be managed separately if at all possible. I know in a seed stock setting it's much more likely. Some of our commercial cattlemen that I work with, though, that's not always the case, and we really need to think about how we manage those heifers. We talked a little bit about you're the source of information sometimes for commercial cattlemen. So one of the things that I tell folks is even if you can't manage all your heifers separately, can we manage them with the thinner cows, right? Because I start talking about sorting off thin cows and managing them separately, and everyone's like, oh, I can't do that. Okay, can we justify then some thin cows and maybe some younger animals that have higher nutrient requirements, group them together, feed them more efficiently, they'll perform better. Now we're feeding the rest of the herd that's fine. We're doing better with them too. So switching gears a little bit over to to the bull side of things and thinking about developing bull nutrition. Just like the heifers, there's some things that we can do along the way to really screw these animals up. And it doesn't matter what genetics are there. If we mess up the management, they're never going to get to express those genetics. And so, and that's not a slight on genetics at all. They're super important, but we've also got to follow through then once those genetics are on the ground with our management and our nutrition. So that proper nutrition early in life leads right into the establishment of puberty. That rolls right into that animal's productivity and ultimately profitability. So if we think about that job description for a bull, right, that bull should be able to produce highly fertile spermatozoa, enough quantity, and possess the ability to efficiently and successfully deliver it and generate a pregnancy. Right, that's the simplest definition of what a bull is supposed to do and what his job description is. So we need to then figure out the nutritional components to get him there. So if we look at some of those nutrient requirements, just like we talked about on the heifer side, right? If we think back to maybe that lactating cow, she's about 60% energy. These developing bulls are going to be north of that, right? So we've got to think about the fact that they may need a little bit more attention than their older counterparts, and that's okay. Because again, if we get into a situation where we're just feeding them in a way that like we do our older animals, again, I think we can set ourselves up for trouble and really run these bulls into the ground. So they've got higher requirements, especially when they're younger. And that carries forward to even after once they become yearlings as well. So just like those heifers, what we do pre-puberty can really set them up for success or not. So nutrition pre-weaning for our bulls ultimately has an impact on bull fertility. So what we're doing at the seed stock level has an impact on what that bull is going to be able to do for the customer. We can affect gonadal development, their endocrine system, ultimately their sperm production, and their ability to produce sperm. So in some work where they basically took bulls and managed them on different planes of nutrition pre-puberty, and then managed everything else the same, age at puberty is different, right? So it's the delayed onset of puberty, testicular development is decreased. The amount of semen that's produced, the sperm concentration in that semen, motility of that sperm, all of that is greatly decreased, and it starts with what we're doing even pre-weaning. So making sure that we're not making these guys rough it along, and that they are growing and that they get the nutrients that they need. Looking at post-weaning, so grain versus grass, right? And depending on who you are, how you manage bulls, this might be a bit of a controversial subject, whether we're developing them in a bull test station or or maybe developing them more out on grass. But there's some pretty stark differences there that's been shown throughout the literature that again, we have increases in semen output, scrotal circumference, and ultimately fertility of these bulls when we grow them on grass. And the real reason behind that is probably that we're not getting them quite so fat. So I apologize, those graphs are really small, but I'm going to walk you through what they are. So this is, again, some other work that was done looking at planar nutrition of bulls. So low energy, which was a no concentrate, roughage-based diet, medium and high energy, so adding in some supplement there. So looking at body weight, there in that top graph, there's really no surprise. The ones that had higher energy had higher body weight, so on and so forth. Then we've got back fat in that next graph, same thing, okay? Lower energy, lower back fat, so on and so forth. That's really no surprise. But what I want you to take home here is that when we move down to scrotal circumference, which my friends in the repro world tell me is one of the most important indicators of how fertile that bull's gonna be, now all of a sudden, those high energy bulls end up on the lower scrotal circumference. So we can run into some issues there as well. We talked a lot about fescue toxicosis. We do a lot of work at the University of Kentucky in fescue toxicosis. We're lucky to have a USDA ARS unit in Lexington, and their whole mission of their research program is looking at fescue and forage production here in the state and managing cattle in that environment. Not only do we have fescue toxicosis here, but we have a lot of heat. We actually turned down the heat for you all this week. It's not nearly as hot as it has been here, but we deal with a lot of heat stress in this state. And I'm sure depending on where you're at, you're dealing with the same thing as well. And one thing that we probably don't give enough attention to is the impact of that heat stress on our cattle. And while there's not a lot that we can do to manage the weather, as much as we all might wish we could, there are things that we can be aware of in how we manage those cattle and their ability to withstand that heat stress. So when we get bulls too fat, we increase the fat deposition in the scrotum. That increased fat deposition does exactly what we think it would do, right? It insulates. And while that might be good when we think about back fat on a cow in the middle of winter in the upper Great Plains, that's really not good for a bull that's going out and trying to breed cows in the Mid-South. And so this is some thermo-imaging of some different bulls. And so the one picture there's what normal would look like, right? And then we have pictures of what abnormal would look like. And so we see that increased insulation due to the fat deposition there. So we know that sperm motility decreases drastically when we develop heat stress in bulls. The problem is that then doesn't just go away. It lasts for up to 8 weeks. So when this happens in the middle of a breeding season, that's a world of hurt, right? And a lot of times when I look through, bull catalogs and things like that, right, there's a lot of fat bulls in the world. And so we need to make sure, especially when we expect them to turn out and go to work in the Mid-South, that we don't run into a situation where they're not able to do their job because we got them too fat. So thinking about nutrition on the bull side, just some practical strategies. Again, this is some work I did developing some different sample rations with some of our common co-products that we feed here in the Mid-South. But those yearling bulls, we typically develop them at about 2.5 to 4 pounds per day, again, depending on what that system might look like. And so to get that, we need about 8 to 12 pounds of a supplement plus good quality pasture or bumping that up even more, depending on what our pasture base is. These are all, again, common feedstuffs that we have here out in the state and in this region. And so these are things that I think, make a decent supplement without getting too much of any one co-product in there. That's, as a ruminant nutritionist, that's one of the easiest ways to keep yourself out of trouble is don't get too much of any one ingredient. You'll probably be okay. So we've talked about managing that condition, right? But recognizing too that we can run into issues if they get too thin. But coming into that breeding season, those bulls need to be all right. And so what happens when we develop bulls in such a manner that they're on these really high energy diets and they're performing really well? That commercial cattleman buys that bull, brings him home, turns him out on his not so managed fescue pastures, and he falls apart. We can really run into issues with how those cattle perform. But looking again at that body condition score of these bulls prior to turnout, we can really start to run into issues with things like breeding soundness exams, because again, we know that those really fat bulls don't have the same motility as the bulls that are in better condition. So when we think about managing those bulls during that breeding season, the time to get this right is really before we turn them out, right? Because once they're already out on pasture, we really don't have the opportunity to change their nutrition so much. He's going to work, and so we've got whatever we've got out there for the cow herd, essentially. But recognizing that bulls lose 100 to 200 pounds during a typical breeding season if he's doing his job right. And so one of the things that I think we can help our bull customers start to understand is that when those bulls start to get thin because we're not getting adequate nutrition out there, that they can run into issues. So post breeding season, those bulls really need to have an opportunity to regain that lost condition. They may need a little extra attention rather than putting them out in the lot and forgetting about them. So I know my approaches sometimes are different than others, but I think that if we simplify it down to what our forage base is and what we can do with forages, then we're usually better off in the long run. So feed those bulls to reach that target body weight. We don't need to push them any extra, in my personal opinion. They're out there to breed cows, not to hang the heaviest carcass on the rail. That's the job of their sons. Overfeeding bulls has a significant impact on their reproductive performance. We need to make sure that we understand that as we start to develop them, because what happens early in life can have long-term implications for them. I believe pretty firmly that we can really create problems for the bull customer when we turn these bulls out into kind of average or below average pastures, and they start to fall apart on us. So we need to think about that as we start to develop and select them and help producers manage them. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions. My contact information is up there as well.
Dr. Van Valen, thank you so much. I do have one quick question. Mm-hmm. And you alluded to this, and I was hoping maybe you could pull on it a little bit further. Mm-hmm. Some of Rick Funston's work out in Nebraska really kind of describes, and you were going here, and I just want to go one step further about how that plain nutrition and that heifer early in life, I may not be using the right appropriate nutritionist terminology, but kind of programs her needs for later in life. So if we're being overly generous early, we force her to be needy later on and vice versa. Could you pull on that just a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about how we manage those cattle early in life, if we again set them up where to be successful as a heifer, they actually require more nutrients than they do as a cow. If we really start to mess with that too much, then we can ultimately affect their nutritional requirements later in life. The other thing that we can really start to do is back them up. So they hit puberty later, they get bred later, so on and so forth. And then they've ultimately have set themselves on a lower trajectory than their counterparts that hit puberty earlier, get bred earlier, wean calves, all that. So.
Anybody have any particular questions? Oh, I got one right here. Let me hand you the microphone, sir, so everybody can hear. I know. They're worried about it on the other side of the room that I'm giving this to you.
Anyways, I think a lot of people in the room, as purebred shorthorn breeders or purebred breeders of any type, I think one of the things we typically mess up is management of our recip herd, because when you have a recip, I'm a firm believer in the first trimester of her pregnancy is when you really do the most development to the fetus, not the last. And I think that would be good to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's actually it's an area that I have a lot of questions for some of our reproductive physiologists, especially when we start thinking about that recip cow, right? Because we've already established the basics of the genetic when we put that embryo in there, but we know that there is a lot of signaling that happens within that uterus, and there's a lot of signaling that happens during that pregnancy that's coming from the maternal cow, which in a recip situation is that recip cow. And so we are just starting, I think, in the beef industry to really understand the whole world of fetal programming. And what we do during gestation has prolonged impacts on offspring. We know that on the human side. There's some great folks in the industry studying that, and we're just starting to really get there. But it's something that I have a lot of questions about, especially as we start thinking about genetics that are developed in one part of the world or one part of the country, and then we go maybe put them in a recip cow in a very different part of the country. Those genetics were developed, say, maybe in Montana, and we go put them in a cow in Kentucky. How is that going to work? How is that embryo ultimately going to develop? Would that embryo develop as well in Kentucky as it would have if it stayed in Montana? We don't really have the answers to that, but that is a burning question that I have as a scientist to really understand. Just knowing that, but understand that nutrition during gestation has impacts, and we do know that. And so just to put an embryo in there and say we've got it in there and we're good to go, I think we probably need to pay attention to how we manage that recip herd.
Any other questions? One last question I would have then is, how do you balance this conversation on the bull side between, scrotal circumference as a measure, which, to be clear, actually a lot of geneticists would question as a meaningful metric, actually. The data would suggest it's not as powerful as what we might think. But as we seek, as cattlemen and cattlewomen, we seek scrotal circumference. A lot of these high-gaining cattle, we're adding some fat around there. So as we're measuring greater scrotal circumference, to your point, we're also insulating them. Mm-hmm. Any way for us on a farm or ranch level to try to distinguish between the tissues, anything we should do, or just live with it?
Yeah, that is a great question that I don't have a great answer for, but you're absolutely right. If you're simply measuring scrotal circumference, that's not getting down to the tissue level. And when the reproductive physiologists really started the idea that scrotal circumference was so closely tied to fertility, I'm guessing they did that work in cows that in bulls that had similar body condition scores. But when you start putting that into the conversation of overly conditioned versus adequately conditioned bulls, that extra fat deposition that is there, that's not necessarily helping the situation. But if you're just taking that base measure of scrotal circumference, it's not accounting for it. And so, I think one of the best things in terms of just being able to look at those tissues or managing it that way, I would say I'd much rather manage the herd and not get them overly conditioned to start with.
Okay. I think that puts us on time for you all to get a quick break. I think you have an opportunity to jump on a bus here shortly, if I'm not mistaken. One more time, give Dr. Van Valen our appreciation. Thank you.